The town of Willowbrook was the kind of place where life seemed to move at a slower pace. People knew each other's names, greeted one another with smiles, and went about their business with a sense of comfort. The streets, lined with old brick buildings and quiet shops, felt almost timeless. Every day was much the same as the one before, with the soft hum of routine filling the air. Among the town's residents was George, an elderly man whose presence had become as familiar as the sound of the morning birds. Every day he could be seen pushing a worn shopping cart down the sidewalk, collecting cans from the streets and alleyways. His back was hunched with age, and his clothes were tattered, the fabric fraying at the seams. Though he was an older man, with deeply lined skin that showed years of hardship, there was a quiet strength in his movements. Most people in town had grown accustomed to his routine. They would pass by him without a second glance, busy with their own lives, their minds focused on tasks that seemed more important. But there was something different about George, something that Johnny Depp, who was in town filming for a new movie, couldn't quite ignore. Johnny first saw George while walking to the set. He noticed how the elderly man's eyes sparkled with a silent determination as he sifted through the discarded cans. It wasn't until the second time Johnny passed him that he realized George wasn't just collecting cans. He was fighting for something, perhaps not for wealth, but for his place in a world that had long forgotten him. For the next few days, Johnny couldn't shake the image of George from his mind. Every morning, as he walked to the set, he would see the elderly man with his cart, tirelessly picking up cans from the ground. Even in the scorching heat of midday, George worked without complaint. Johnny was taken by the way George moved with purpose, his face etched with years of struggle, yet there was something about his presence that seemed strangely dignified. It wasn't just the physical work that impressed Johnny, it was the fact that George never seemed to stop. He'd smile politely at those who passed by, but it was clear that George didn't expect any help or pity. He was simply doing what he could to survive in a world that had moved on without him. Johnny felt a mixture of sadness and admiration watching him. There was a fire in George's spirit, a quiet determination that spoke volumes, and it stirred something deep within Johnny. On the fifth day, after watching George pick through the cans in an alley near the diner, Johnny made up his mind. He couldn't keep observing from a distance anymore. Johnny approached George, not as a movie star but as a regular man, eager to understand the life of someone who had lived so differently from his own. "Hey there," Johnny said with a friendly smile. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" George paused, clearly surprised that someone had approached him, especially someone who looked like they belonged in a different world. But after a moment of hesitation, he gave a small nod. "Not at all, son," he said, his voice rough but warm. "It's a good day to be out." Johnny sat beside him on the curb, and they began talking. George's story unfolded slowly, a life filled with both hardship and resilience. He spoke of losing his job years ago, how the economy had left him with nothing, and how his wife's passing had only made the weight heavier. He shared how he had no family left to lean on, no one to turn to. Collecting cans had become his way of making ends meet, and though it wasn't glamorous, it kept him going. "Sometimes," George said, a faraway look in his eyes, "you just gotta keep moving, even when life gives you more than you can handle. What else is there to do, right?" Johnny was taken aback by George's quiet wisdom. Despite everything, there was no bitterness in his voice. No sense of defeat, just a simple truth: keep moving, keep trying. Johnny's heart swelled with respect for the old man, and he felt a deep connection he hadn't expected. From that day forward, Johnny visited George regularly. Sometimes he brought lunch, nothing fancy, just a sandwich or a cup of coffee, and they'd sit together talking about life, the struggles, and the small victories. Johnny came to look forward to these moments, each visit reminding him of the strength of the human spirit and the unexpected friendships that could bloom in the most unlikely of places. As the days went by, Johnny's admiration for George only grew. Each visit left a lasting impression on him, and the more he listened to George's story, the more Johnny felt moved by the old man's resilience. But there was something else weighing on Johnny's heart. It wasn't just George, it was the realization that George wasn't alone. Johnny began to think about the thousands of elderly people like George, hidden in plain sight, living in poverty and struggling to make ends meet. He thought about all those men and women who, like George, were overlooked and forgotten by society. Their stories were rarely told, and their needs went unnoticed. Johnny felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to do something more. One afternoon, as he watched George struggle to pull his cart up a steep sidewalk, the idea hit Johnny like a bolt of lightning. What if he could do something bigger than just helping George? What if he could bring attention to the plight of the elderly across the country? That evening, Johnny sat down with his team, scribbling ideas and plans on a napkin. He was determined to make a change, to make sure people saw the elderly in a different light. He didn't want it to just be about his personal efforts to help George. No, this was bigger than that. It was about making a real difference, about inspiring others to look beyond their own lives and take action. Johnny came up with a plan for a public campaign that would highlight George's story, but the focus wouldn't be on George alone. It would be about the countless seniors who had slipped through the cracks, quietly suffering in the background. Johnny wanted to show the world that elderly people, especially those living in poverty, needed to be seen, heard, and supported. The campaign would share George's story with the world, but it would also call on people to take action. Johnny's message was simple: we can all do something, no matter how small. He urged people to donate to local charities, volunteer with senior citizens, and raise awareness about the struggles faced by the elderly. Using his celebrity status, Johnny worked with his team to create a series of social media posts, interviews, and public service announcements, but the message was never about him. It was always about the cause. Johnny wasn't seeking fame or recognition for himself. He simply wanted to inspire others to make a difference, to open their eyes to a part of society they had long ignored. The campaign launched with a quiet intensity, and Johnny hoped that it would spark a change. But deep down, he had a feeling that it might be more powerful than he could have imagined. The day Johnny's campaign went live, he had no idea how quickly it would gain momentum. The world was ready for something like this, something genuine, something that sparked compassion. News outlets across the country picked up the story almost immediately. The headline read, "Johnny Depp, an elderly man's story spark nationwide movement to help seniors in need." Within hours, social media exploded. Hashtags like #SeeTheElderly and #GeorgeStory trended across every platform. Ordinary people, celebrities, and organizations alike began sharing George's story. Photos of George with his shopping cart, along with Johnny's heartfelt message about the elderly living in poverty, filled news feeds everywhere. It didn't take long for donations to start pouring in. What began as small gestures grew into large-scale support. People sent money, food, clothing, and even their time. The campaign wasn't just about raising funds, it was about shifting the narrative and showing the world that the elderly deserved more than to be forgotten. Stories of individuals who had been inspired by George and Johnny flooded social media. One woman shared a photo of her elderly neighbor, whom she hadn't spoken to in years, now sitting at her kitchen table, smiling over a meal she'd prepared. Another man posted about how he'd begun volunteering at a local senior center, spending time with seniors who had been isolated for far too long. The campaign went viral in a way that Johnny hadn't imagined. What started as an attempt to raise awareness quickly turned into a nationwide movement. People from every corner of the country began to see their elderly neighbors in a new light. Compassion flowed freely. Towns started to organize events to collect donations, while others set up local volunteer programs aimed at supporting seniors. Johnny, despite the overwhelming support, remained focused on the bigger picture. He wanted this to be more than a trend, more than just a moment in time. The donations were important, but they weren't the end goal. The real change needed to happen at a deeper level. Johnny worked tirelessly to ensure that the funds raised went directly to elderly people in need. He partnered with trusted local organizations to make sure that the help was reaching those who truly needed it. It was about providing long-term support, not just a temporary solution. Johnny also made sure that the movement didn't end with a donation drive. He pushed for national initiatives aimed at creating permanent programs for the elderly. Soon, a local charity stepped in, offering to match every dollar raised by the campaign. The partnership gave the movement even more momentum, and soon Johnny and George became the faces of a national initiative designed to ensure every elderly person had access to food, healthcare, and housing. Johnny's heart swelled with pride as the movement grew, but he knew it was only the beginning. The real power of the campaign was that it wasn't just about helping George, it was about starting a conversation. It was about reminding people that there were real human lives behind the numbers and statistics of poverty. The elderly were not invisible, they were worth helping, worth caring for. And through their efforts, Johnny and George had sparked a change that went far beyond what either of them had ever imagined. As the movement continued to grow, something unexpected happened. The more attention George's story received, the more people started to dig into his past. News outlets, eager to learn more about the humble man behind the viral campaign, began reaching out to locals who might have known him before his life took a turn. That's when the truth about George's past began to surface, and it sent shockwaves through the community. It was revealed that George wasn't just any elderly man collecting cans for survival. He had once been a prominent figure in Willowbrook, a beloved teacher who had dedicated his life to shaping the minds of countless students. For years he had taught history at the local high school, leaving a lasting impact on generations of young people. His students spoke of his kindness, his patience, and his ability to make even the most difficult subjects come alive in the classroom. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a mentor, someone who guided many toward successful careers and bright futures. For those who hadn't known his history, the revelation was a shock. How could this man, someone who had helped so many, end up living on the streets, collecting cans for survival? It seemed impossible that someone with such a legacy could fade into obscurity, but that was exactly what had happened. George had fallen on hard times, losing his job years ago when the school had faced budget cuts. After his wife passed away, things spiraled further. He refused to accept charity or pity, and rather than ask for help, he quietly withdrew from society, refusing to let anyone see his pain. The revelation sent a ripple through the town, and soon, former students came forward to share their memories of George. Some spoke of how he had encouraged them to pursue careers they never thought possible, while others shared how George had been a constant source of support during tough times in their lives. One former student, now a successful lawyer, spoke publicly about how George had given him the confidence to stand up for himself when others doubted him. Another former student, a now well-known doctor, shared how George had inspired his love for history and learning. This revelation added a new layer of depth to the campaign, and the community responded in a way no one could have expected. People who had once ignored George now felt an intense connection to him. The movement became more than just about helping an elderly man. It was about honoring his legacy and ensuring that his contributions to the town were never forgotten. People rallied together, not just to help George, but to ensure that other elderly individuals whose contributions may have been overlooked received the recognition and care they deserved. The movement grew even stronger as more and more people shared their stories, and the town united in a collective effort to honor the man who had once shaped their lives in ways they had never realized. It wasn't just a campaign anymore, it was a celebration of the impact one person could have, and how in the end no one is ever truly invisible. The movement, which had started as a small act of compassion, quickly began to snowball into something far greater than anyone had ever anticipated. As George's story spread across the country, people from every corner of the nation began to take notice. Johnny and George were invited to appear on talk shows, where they shared their journey and the transformation they had witnessed in their town. Their message resonated deeply, touching the hearts of millions. Soon their story was being told in schools, churches, and community centers, inspiring a new generation to recognize the elderly in their own lives. Celebrities who had heard George's story firsthand started to lend their voices to the cause. The likes of Reese Witherspoon, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and Taylor Swift shared their support on social media, urging their fans to join the movement. Their influence brought even more attention to the plight of elderly people living in poverty. Fundraisers, donation drives, and volunteer opportunities popped up everywhere, and new initiatives were created to provide essential services like free meals, medical checkups, and housing to elderly individuals who were struggling to make ends meet. For Johnny, the journey had been an emotional one, but it was George who had become the true face of the movement. No longer just the elderly man collecting cans, George had transformed into a symbol of resilience and dignity. His story of perseverance in the face of hardship resonated with people from all walks of life. He had become the embodiment of the power of community, showing that when people come together, they can create meaningful change. With the growing momentum, the movement soon reached a political level. Advocacy groups began pushing for new policies to ensure that elderly citizens had better access to financial aid, healthcare, and basic services. Local governments began taking action, creating programs designed to support seniors in need. One of the most significant victories came when a new law was passed, ensuring that elderly citizens across the nation would have more access to resources that could help them live healthier and more dignified lives. The law mandated improvements to healthcare services for seniors, as well as programs to assist with housing and financial aid. It was a victory not only for George, but for every elderly person who had felt forgotten by society. Johnny continued his support of the campaign, but he knew that George was the true heart of it all. As the movement grew, Johnny took on the role of an advocate and spokesperson, but it was George's quiet strength and unwavering spirit that inspired so many people to take action. The final scene of the story unfolded in a quiet park one evening, where Johnny and George stood side by side, watching as people continued to gather for a community event in honor of the elderly. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the scene. Johnny looked at George and smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everything they had accomplished together. "It started with you, George," Johnny said softly. George chuckled, his eyes twinkling with humility. "It wasn't just me, Johnny, it was all of us." Johnny nodded, his heart full. The movement had become something that would continue to grow, to change lives, and to give the elderly the respect and dignity they deserved. Together they had sparked a revolution of kindness that would keep making a difference for generations to come. The story closes with a sense of hope and renewal. Johnny and George stand as living proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can create waves of change. Their bond has not only transformed their own lives, but sparked a nationwide movement that continues to grow. Johnny, once a famous actor, now realizes the true power of compassion and the ripple effect that one good deed can have on the world. George, with his humble heart, has shown the world that no matter how unnoticed someone may seem, they can still make a profound difference. His quiet strength and resilience have inspired countless others to stand up for the elderly and those in need, reminding everyone that compassion is always worth sharing. Together, Johnny and George have set the stage for a future where the elderly are cared for and valued, a future shaped by kindness and community. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey of kindness, perseverance, and community. Johnny and George's story shows us that even the smallest acts of compassion can create a ripple effect, inspiring change in ways we never imagined. We hope it touched your heart as much as it did ours. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. Let's spread the message of kindness and care for those who need it most. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. Together we can make a difference.